Sonos has opened the floodgates with the new Era speakers. Now I have to do my reviews all over again with the various combination of soundbars with the new options for Era 100 and the 300 speakers. And this is made complicated by the fact that Sonos now has two different size subwoofers. Now today is the first official hands-on full-time review of the Sonos Era speakers in my home. Now, in my previous videos, I have made my first impression comments on the Era 100 and the 300, but this time round, it is my review after having listened to them extensively with my own musical preference in my home setup in my room here. Now, in this video, I will not be going through all the functionalities and the specs for both speakers. Now, I've covered them extensively in previous launch videos, and if you have missed them, do check them out right here. I have them linked. Now, what I will be covering is the use of these speakers in your setup and how they will sound, and whether you should upgrade from whatever you are having to these speakers. Now, as usual in my video, I like to provide kind of like an upfront summary. Now, Sonos has a huge ecosystem, and this is by no means a complete summary, but it should cover the most basic question that most of you will have. Do you upgrade your current surround speakers to the Era 100 or the 300 speakers? Now, I'll try to be as concise as possible. If you are already using a Sonos One with your existing soundbar, you won't get much more if you move to the Era 100. So only consider upgrading if you want and can move to the Era 300. Then again, the Era 300 will only work with the Beam Gen 2 and the Sonos Arc. So if you are on the Sonos Ray or the earlier Beam Gen 1 or even the Sonos M, the Era 300 will not work. Now, the Era 300 will add a truly new dimension to your setup. For Beam Gen 2 users, you are now going to get two actual upward firing drivers. Given that the Beam Gen 2 only uses simulated Atmos without actual upward firing drivers on the soundbar itself, this is a big upgrade. But think carefully, as a pair of the Era 300 costs almost double of the Beam Gen 2 itself. So if you are using the Arc, then the price parity is more even there. The Arc costs about $900 US, and a pair of the Era 300 also costs about $900. Now that ends up to be actually a shitload of money still, but if you are out for the ultimate, I'd like to state once and for all, this is currently going to be your best Sonos speaker for the Sonos surround setup. Now, at this point in time, you can trust me enough to go after this upfront summary, right? You might have already decided to buy or not to buy already, so you don't have to watch the rest of the video. But you might want to stay on if you would like to hear how I arrived at this conclusion for the recommendation of the Era 100 and the Era 300. Now, if you have other questions on other combinations, let me know in the comment section down below so that I know exactly what I need to address in future videos. If you do leave a question, I'll appreciate it if you could also leave a like and give this channel a sub so that I get rewarded for my work. So let's get to a little bit more details about the Sonos Era speakers setup. Now, both the Era 100 and the 300 are capable of being standalone speakers or paired into a stereo pair setup, or even connected as surrounds into your Sonos home theater setup. Now, I'm taking the cue from one of the viewers out here in the channel to discuss the performance of both speakers in either music or movie setup. Why? Because requirements are actually slightly different. Now, if you think about it, a Sonos Arc works great as a movie soundbar, but when asked to play music, it stumbles, and really a pair of Sonos Ones at a fraction of the price of the Sonos Arc sounds much better than the Sonos Arc for music. So first, as music speakers, I do have the Era 100 on its own as standalone speakers. Now, I will be testing them as a stereo pair at some point in time, but it just can't cover all the combinations in one video today. On its own, I know that the Era 100 is already capable of stereo imaging. Just have to say this, that the stereo image is nowhere near my expectation. It is not as wide as the Sonos 5s on its own. Most of the sound seems to cast from this small speaker itself, like from a single point in the whole room. Now, I tried quite a few songs which I know to cast a pretty wide image, but none of them actually return a wide enough soundstage for my preference. Now, don't get me wrong, okay? I'm saying that it is actually better than the Sonos ones or the Play ones, given that it does have additional tweeters allowing the placement of both the left and the right tweeters to throw a stereo image left and the right. But it just doesn't project the stereo image, which is up to my expectation. So if you are upgrading from a single Sonos 1 to a single Era 100, expecting a huge soundstage improvement or upgrade, you probably won't get it. But what you will get is a bass and mid-range upgrade. Now the drivers from the Era 100 is actually bigger than the one from the Sonos ones, and for that, the Play ones. And that immediately translates into better bass. Now, in theory, at least, right? Now, I'm happy to report that it also translates to actual bass upgrade in practice. Now, at this point, I'd like to bring the frequency response charts that this channel usually does to measure the output from speakers that are being tested. So right now, let me pull up the Sonos one. So imagine you're very familiar with the Sonos ones right here, okay? And you know its sound signature very well. You might notice that the Sonos does bump up the upper bass frequencies up a little bit to make them sound larger than the sound that the size itself would indicate. Now I'm going to pull up the green chart right here. Now the green chart here shows the response for the Sonos ones from 20 Hz all the way up to 20,000 Hz. Now the higher bass frequency bump is evident in the bump at about 90 Hz or so. Now, this is almost like a Sonos signature already. The frequency response then tails off a little bit from about 100 to 200 Hz, but it holds up quite well all the way till about 800 Hz or so. After 800 Hz, there is a cliff from there, and it starts to tail off all the way till at about 8 kilohertz. Now, this is what we are used to, and it visually tells you about the Sonos One's sounds that you have been listening to all these years. Now, of course, EQ and TruePlay will change that, but this is the stock setting for the Sonos Ones. Now, next, I will overlay the frequency response curve from the Era 100. Now, I expect that there is a slightly better bass, but enough with the guesses and the expectation. The red curve here, it shows the response from the Era 100. Now you'll notice that it has the same high bass bump at about 90 Hz, and it actually does hold the bass slightly better than the Sonos ones, giving it a couple of dBs more down at the lower bass regions of 30 to 40 Hz, where it's actually not that audible anymore, but you will get the feeling that the bass is slightly stronger. So what is actually more interesting about the red curve for the Era 100 is that it holds the mid-range and the treble response much better than the Sonos ones, all the way to about 5 kHz or so. Now, as with the Sonos one, it tails off from about 8 kHz, but maintaining a slightly higher output at the higher frequencies. Now, overall, the Era 100 will have a flatter response than the Sonos ones. Now, what all this means is that the Era 100 is a slightly better sounding speaker. Now, how much better? Well, the price difference is technically just $20 difference between the two in the US. I know Singapore has a much higher sticker price for the Era 100 than the Sonos ones, but the Sonos one is going to be deprecated and you won't be able to buy them anymore pretty soon. Now, overall, the Era 100 is a better speaker, but whether the price difference is justifiable, that you really have to figure it out for yourself. Now, switching between the ones and the Era 100 while playing music, you'll notice that the bass is definitely coming out stronger and is better controlled on the Era 100. It is not a huge difference. Sonos did not make the bass louder, it just made the bass a little bit better controlled. Well, so now next we will move on to the Era 300 for music. Now the sound signature for the Era 300 when it comes to music is something that we are not familiar with at all. The Era 300 has an incredibly spaced out kind of sound to it. Whether this is good or not truly depends on you. Now, I can imagine that a very traditional stereo audiophile is not going to like this, we are talking about the soundstage here. Now, the Era 300 is engineered to be a spatial audio monster. Now, by the time you see this video, you would have been able to stream Dolby Atmos music from Apple Music. Now, this feature is going to be made available to Sonos users from 28 March 2023 onwards. The other source of Dolby Atmos music is from Amazon Music HD. Unfortunately, Singapore doesn't have Amazon Music HD. So at this point in time of producing a video, I'm unable to test Atmos music. But please do consider subscribing to this channel, as I will be performing an Era 300 Dolby Atmos music review on the speaker the moment it becomes available on the 28th of March, which I need a couple of days, or maybe I need a weekend after the 28th of March to produce the video. Now, given that it is a speaker that is engineered for spatial audio, the placement of all the 6 drivers on the Era 300 is nothing short of revolutionary for music bias speakers. Now, most speakers have drivers that fire forward, right? The Sonos 5s, they have 6 drivers, and all the drivers are on the front face plate of the 5s. Now, out of the 6 drivers on the Era 300, only one is located in the front of the speaker. There are 2 drivers firing off to the right here, and there are 2 more drivers firing off to the left. And they are located, well, left and right of the speaker, not towards the left front plate, but on the actual left and on the actual right. The last driver is an upward firing driver that throws sound off from the top. Now, when you listen to the Era 300, the first thing that hits you immediately is that the sound isn't coming out of the speaker itself. It's a strange feeling. The sound is actually radiating from all sides of the speaker. When it comes to non-vocal music, this throws a rather enjoyable, a very huge soundstage. But if your choice of music entails a lot of vocals, that you will find that the voice is thrown all over the room. Now, this is very, very different from traditional speakers and very different from the ones, the Era 100 and the 5s. This, I can imagine, will really benefit from properly encoded Dolby Atmos music, which I cannot test at this moment right now. So while the Era 100 is sounding quite pinpoint focused with sounds coming from within the speaker itself, confines of the speaker itself, the Era 300 seems to have sound coming like from all over. So that is the soundstage for the Era 300. Now, I've also made a frequency response chart for the Era 300, and that is the line in cyan right here on the chart. Now, both speakers in the test are set at the same volume at about 65%, and the red line represents the Era 100, which I've put up earlier. The immediate observation that anyone can see is that the speaker is louder across the board. There is more bass, more mids, more treble for the Era 300 as compared to the Era 100. The bass is significantly better on the Era 300, which you can see produces up to 3 dB more bass at the 40 Hz mark. But the bass signature is similar to the Era 100, just louder at the same volume. The mids are also louder, retaining the same sound signature as the Era 100. But the treble coming from the Era 300 is significantly louder from 1500 Hz onwards, and it still maintains a great deal of control over the treble all the way up to forever. Now, we do expect that this sort of curve is we do expect it because it's a bigger speaker as compared to the Era 100, and it's 6 drivers compared to the 3 drivers on the Era 100. So you have not already noticed this. The Era 300 actually has an even flatter response curve than the Era 100, which by itself already has a flatter response curve than the Sonos ones. So if you are buying this speaker purely for music, note one thing. The speaker itself is capable, as evident by the frequency response charts. But what the frequency response chart doesn't tell you is how it throws that sound, that frequency around. The soundstage is not a traditional stereo soundstage. And if you are buying this speaker for music, you definitely want to understand that difference. Now, in fact, if you need to audition it for yourself in person, test it against a pair of the Era 100, which will give a more traditional stereo soundstage, or even against the Sonos 5s, which on its own is capable of producing stereo and gives a much more traditional sound. Now, speaking of audition, I am conducting a first ever listening session with you guys. Now, and this is going to happen in person. I had this idea since late last year and wanted to find a place, a venue, where I can personally meet up with you guys over some pizza and just, talk about our common interests. But I never got around to doing it, partly due to the fact that I wasn't sure if you guys were interested, but mainly it's because I wasn't able to find and afford the right place for such a session and handling the logistics. Now, I brought this idea up to TC Acoustic, which is the Sonos distributor for Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and some other countries in Southeast Asia, I can't remember. And they actually have kindly agreed to lend us the space and allowing access to all the Sonos speaker in their experience center for us to host this event. So this coming Friday evening, right, on the 31st of March, at 8 p.m, I will be hosting a closed-door event where we can audition all the Sonos speakers, including the Era 100, including the Era 300s, and chat to our heart's content about all things Sonos. And of course, I'll be there. Now, this is limited to 30 slots due to the space limitation. I don't know how the response is going to be like, but if you do sign up, please do attend. And if you do attend, please know that you are also able to buy these speakers if you do like them after listening to them. It is like a live YouTube selling event, which I've hosted before, except that you'll be able to attend it in person and it will be interactive. You ask the questions and I respond to you immediately. Now, you do obviously have to be in Singapore to attend this event, and I'm really looking forward to meet some of you in person. Now, for those of you who aren't able to attend, you might also be wondering about how the Era 300 sounds when compared with the Sonos 5s. Now, the chart for the Sonos 1, the Era 100, and the Era 300 gave us an idea of how they fare against each other, but how about going against the flagship Sonos 5s for music? Well, here you go. The frequency response curve for the Sonos 5 as shown in yellow here. The mid-range response up to the treble is actually quite flat too, although it doesn't come across as loud as the Era 300. In fact, if you look at the 80 Hz frequency cutoff, everything above that, the Era 300 is actually louder. But the true superpower of the Sonos 5s is that the low-end response is phenomenal. Below 80 Hz, neither the Era 100 nor the 300 are able to hold up against the output from the Sonos 5s. Now, both the Era 100 and the 300 speakers will tail off, dipping all the way down from 80 Hz, but the Sonos 5 still manages a flat response all the way till about 30 Hz before it starts to tail off. Now, not many standalone speakers are able to generate audible bass at 30 Hz, but looking at the yellow curve, it is evident that the Sonos 5 is able to generate significant levels of bass down to 30 Hz. In fact, even at 25 Hz, it still holds its bass line pretty well. And at 25 Hz, it is already approaching subwoofer levels of bass. Now, to put it another way, the levels at 25 Hz is as loud as the levels are at 150 Hz, which is quite something. Now, if all these charts are confusing to you, let me summarize it a little bit for you. When it comes to music, nothing beats the Sonos 5s. Not the Era 300 even. You don't even need subwoofer to get musical bass out of the Sonos 5s. The Era 100 is a small upgrade to the Sonos 1s. So unless you're getting a new system, there's really no need for you to upgrade from your Sonos 1s to the Era 100. But if you're getting a new setup, there's no reason to choose the Sonos 1s over the Era 100. Now, the Era 300 is first and foremost by design a spatial audio speaker. It is meant to create atmosphere, soundstage, and omnipresence music which permeates your entire living space. It is not meant to be used in a critical stereo listening setup where you need a good room treatment and specific listening position. Now, for younger folks as well as those who are playing music to entertain guests, the Era 300 is going to sound superior. For those after a more traditional music listening setup in a listening environment, a very well treated one, the Sonos 5 still cannot be beaten. Now, when I'm able to stream Atmos music from Apple Music, I will be back with another head-on comparison and review the Era 300 against the Sonos 5s. Now, if you're still undecided by then, do check out that video. In any case, I hope to have given you a good rundown of my experience with the Era 100 and the 300 when it comes to music listening. Whew, I knew this video was going to be long, but I didn't know it was going to be this long. Now, thank God I put in the upfront summary in front of the video. For those of you who are still watching and hanging around, thank you for rewarding my hard work with your watch time. Now, if you find this video still interesting at this point, do consider dropping me a super thanks to buy me a coffee when I'm talking to you about the Sonos Era 100 and the 300. Or you can simply use Patreon account, which I have the QR code right here, and you can use that to contribute the same to my coffee fund. And I assure you, over the next couple of months, they are going to be exciting, as I have like 20-30 videos lined up for just the Sonos Era speakers alone in various combinations. Now, with that out of the way, let me give you an idea of how these speakers are performing in a home theater setup. Now, I do apologize, but I'm unable to test the Era 100 in a home theater setup at the moment. Why? Because I only have one Era 100 speaker at this moment in time. So while it's capable of projecting stereo, you still need a pair of them in order to link them up as surrounds. Now, I'll be doing a video of the Era 100 in the near future with them deployed as surround, but today I will focus on the Era 300 in a home theater setup. Now, the Era 300 costs $449 each, right? Quite a bit more expensive than the Era 100 at $249 each. Well, it's almost twice the price, but they are quite literally twice the speaker that the Era 100 is. There are, after all, 6 drivers instead of 3 in the Era 100, and because of the upward firing driver in the Era 300, they are going to truly shine in a home theater setup. In today's test, I have the Era 300 hooked up to the Sonos Arc, right? And the Sonos Arc is paired with 2 Sonos Gen 3 and Gen 2 subwoofers. Now, this is truly the pinnacle of home theater setup that Sonos currently offers. And yes, I have the same Sonos Arc dual sub setup with the Sonos M driving my in-ceiling Sonos speakers that cost more, but it requires extensive installation and is not exactly completely wireless, and you are going to be unlikely to follow you when you actually do move house. Now, the most common configuration that the Sonos Arc users are going to have right now today, before the introduction of the Era speakers, are going to be that with the Sonos One. So on top of the above Sonos in-ceiling setup, I have tested the Sonos Arc setup with the Ones, the Play 3s, the 5s, the IKEA Symphonics, the lamp bookshelf, and the picture frames. Basically, you name it, I have tried them all before. Now, the difference between the setups, they're there, and mostly presents itself as volume differences. The loudest so far that I've tried with the Arc setup as surrounds is the Sonos 5s, but those are even more expensive than the Era 300s. None of the surround setups offer extra Atmos channels, nor significantly better surround effects. Okay, maybe except for the amp driving the in-ceiling speakers, because that's an effect of the fact that the speakers are actually overhead. Now, this is not a real true Atmos setup until today. The Era 300 adds a total of 12 more drivers to your setup, 2 of which fires upwards for true Atmos enhancement, and 8 of them are actually firing sidewards or to the rear, creating a much wider surround soundstage. Now, when I earlier mentioned that the Era 300 soundstaging ability and how it translates to music, the same effect is present here in the use as surround speakers, including the 4 powered drivers in the 2 Sonos Arc and the 11 drivers in the Sonos Arc itself, together with the 12 drivers in the Sonos Era 300, you have a system that's playing 7.2.4 channel Dolby Atmos using a total of 27 drivers. Now let that sink in for just a minute. 27 drivers. So how does that all sound? Well, it is not really about the number of drivers, it is about the placement. Because of the placement of the drivers on the Era 300, your rear soundstage just got a serious upgrade. The Era 300 is a lot more forgiving of the placement. The sounds from the Era 300 comes from like outside the confines of the physical cabinet itself. It radiates from the front, the sides, and more importantly, the top. Right? There are placement constraints, and if you read what Sonos has to say about placement, you should leave at least 8 inches of space around the speaker to get the best effect out of the speaker. Now, in fact, I'll go as far as to say that you should have a clear line of sight from the top of the speaker cabinet to your ceiling. Now, don't go about putting this speaker in bookshelves or cubby holes, all right? Now, Sonos has allowed for the Era 300 to be wall-mounted high up towards the ceiling. And if you are less than 2 feet away from the ceiling, the wall mount from Sonos actually allows for you to mount the Era 300 upside down so that the upward firing speaker is firing downwards, pushing the Atmos channel effects towards you at the listening position from a position that is actually above you. Now, this is going to be an interesting mounting option, which I'm not testing today. I don't have the wall mounts for this. I do have the Era 300 on hi-fi speaker stands right now, which I previously reviewed and used to test and rest my Sonos 5s when they were deployed as my surround speakers. Now, as surround speakers, the Era 300, they truly shine. For those of you who were disappointed by the lack of Atmos effects from just 2 upward firing channels from the Sonos Arc, you're now going to get double the Atmos channels. The upward firing drivers from the Era 300 are also designed in a completely different way from the Sonos Arc. Those on the Era 300 are horn-loaded, and the driver itself is set deep within the cone, directing Atmos sound effects squarely at the ceiling to bounce them off. Now, what this means in actual use is that the Atmos effects are a lot more pronounced. Watching some of the more notable scenes from Spiderhead, All Quiet on the Western Front, Avengers Endgame, it gave a much more immersive effect than the Sonos Arc did with the Sonos 1s or even the Sonos 5s. The volume levels are truly loud, so loud in fact that when I pushed the volume beyond 35 on the volume scale, I got to the point where I got worried that I was going to get complaints from my son who is studying in the room next door. And they are definitely way louder than the Sonos 1s or even the Sonos 5s. Now, I tried it with various positions around the room, and they really are quite forgiving in terms of placement. Now, in other words, what this means is that the Sonos Era 300 creates a much larger surround sweet spot around the room. You're no longer limited to just those seats in the center positions of the listening area. With the Sonos 1s and the Sonos 5s, you do notice that the surround sound effects, they're coming from you from a particular point to your rear, right? In fact, this is the case with any other surround setup, including the lineups from the IKEA Symphonics bookshelf speakers range and the lamp and the picture frame. The Era 300 covers the entire rear with a lot more sound, and because the surround effects doesn't seem to come from a specific point within the speaker cabinet itself, the surround effect is a lot wider and much more dispersed. Now, remember I said that the Era 300 was positioned and designed as a spatial audio speaker? This is the exact use case that the Era 300 was meant to be deployed in. With this in mind, my final recommendation would be to use the Era 300 as surround speakers for your Beam Gen 2 or your Sonos Arc, rather than just for pure Atmos music listening as standalone music speakers. My opinion may change when Dolby Atmos actually gets pumped through from Apple Music to the Era 300 directly. Now, to recap my recommendation, the Sonos Era 100 is a good replacement speaker for the Sonos 1. Now, that said, if you already have the Sonos 1 for music, you don't need to rush out to buy the Era 100 as a replacement. If you are shopping for a new speaker anyway, the Era 100s, they are a true step forward for Sonos' most affordable, most versatile, and the cheapest mains powered speaker. Now, the Sonos Era 300 is a real powerhouse for surround setup. Now, if you want the final word in surround speakers for your Sonos home theater, the Era 300 needs some serious consideration from you. Sonos is pretty late to this game as other competitors had upward firing drivers in the rear speakers for quite some time now. But I'm happy to say that Sonos has created a very compelling offer right here. And instead of just focusing on creating more height sensation in the surround speaker setup, Sonos has chosen to go one step further to create a wider surround sound stage while they are at it. Ooh, this is really long a video, and I hope that Sonos doesn't try to launch two products together within the same announcement in the future. It makes it very tough for me to get information out to you guys in a timely fashion when the embargo lifts. Now, there are now 3 soundbar offerings to start building your home theater setup. That includes the Ray, the Beam, and the Arc. And if you add the M to the mix, you have 4 options to base your home theater setup from. Then there are 2 subs. You have the regular sub Gen 3 and the smaller sub MIDI. Finally, for surrounds, there are 3 IKEA Symphonics options to choose from, and the Sonos 1s, the Sonos 5s, and now the Era 100 and the 300. Now, barring some specific unsupported configurations like the Era 300, not working with the M and the Ray, you're looking at least 50 combinations to build your ideal home theater setup from Sonos to fit every budget. Now, thankfully, I didn't have to cover the specification and the feature set of the Era speakers in this video, as it would have resulted in a much longer video that is excruciatingly long. For those of you who have hung out with me throughout this super long video, please accept my thanks and gratitude. Type in good stuff in the comment section down below so that I know that you made it this far and I can thank you in person. Now, if you are Singaporean, the equivalent Singlish term would be ho liao. The literal translation is good ingredient, either referring to the Era speakers or the content of my video. So what it actually means is good stuff. So if you need more information about the Era speakers, like the specs or the features, do check out the video that I'm linking right here, where I discuss all the features of the speakers. And if there are still things that you need to know about the Era speakers that you have not found out or read about, do check out this video up here, which I talk about the not so commonly known stuff and the restrictions of the Era speakers. Now, I'll see you in either of those videos, preferably both of those videos. So.